So what are some of those challenged employment practices? And we've talked about some of them, right? The testing and educational requirements can lead to a disparate impact, unless the test is appropriate, right? Height and weight requirements. This used to be it was an airline issue. I know that they had flight attendants, right? And they used to have rules about how big they could be, and those were challenged. And the airline tried to hold out. I think they were trying to set an image, but they tried to make the claim that, well, in the event of an emergency, we need them to be able to move up and down the aisles, which are narrow, at a quick pace. The government didn't buy that, or the judge or whomever, made that decision. It didn't buy that and said, nah, I don't think that's right. Okay, and so, can there be probably some weight and height requirements? Maybe, but they would have to be, certainly appropriate, for that particular industry. Appearance and a business necessity. Well, it kind of gets back to the, to the Hooters one a little bit. And, if I'm a banker in a conservative town, can I require that my employees wear, at least sport coats and ties, or, shirts and ties, or, that the women that work there dress in a certain fashion? Yeah, you can. Again, as long as you can prove that it's a business necessity. Okay, it gets difficult. Can you tell people you won't hire them if they have tattoos? Well, tattoos are becoming kind of a norm, and so 20, 30 years ago you probably could have. So okay. Affirmative action and reverse discrimination are, of course, pretty big issues. We're seeing a lot of those things. Seniority systems, we want to say they are always appropriate. Okay, there's nothing wrong with seniority systems. They've been deemed to be appropriate. So. So other employment discrimination laws, if you go back to the Civil Rights Act of 1866, right after the Civil War, bans some racial discrimination. And I think part of your guys' assignment had to do with that, and why folks might still sue under that particular act, right? Age Discrimination and Employment Act protects people that are over 40 years old, okay? And unfortunately not those that work for the states. Strange. Americans with Disability Act, this came along, and honestly, I was in banking when that came along, and it scared us to death. We went to all kinds of seminars and all those other things, and we thought, oh my goodness, the cost is going to be prohibitive, and it's going to be horrible. And it turned out to be kind of none of those things. In fact, it's turned out to be a lot of common sense things that probably people should have been doing, or businesses should have been doing all along. But they hadn't really thought of it. I'm not blaming the businesses at all. But just put in place it says, if you're going to build a new business and you're going to put some bathrooms in it, public restrooms in it, why wouldn't you make those, handicapped accessible? At the time you're building it, the extra cost is almost nothing. Or if you're going to remodel, why wouldn't you do that? And there's exceptions in there for practices that might cause an undue burden, etc. Okay, but it just forces businesses to take a look at ways that they could accommodate, reasonably accommodate folks that might otherwise be disabled and not be able to work if not for that reasonable accommodation. And there are state anti-discrimination laws. I don't know that Montana has any in particular, that certainly none that I'm aware of that go above and beyond what the federal government has. Oh, and then USERRA, I got to go back and look that one up. I forgot what it was, so I'm going to pause for a second. We'll come back. And shame on me, that's probably one of the more important ones, the U.S., because it's Uniform Service Employment and Reemployment Act, or I'm close there anyhow. And that has to do with, of course, folks who may get deployed, who are in the service, oftentimes in the guards, those types of things, and what rights they have to get their jobs back, okay, as a return from their deployments. affirmative action, right? This was an executive order. It's never been a federal statute, right? And administered by the Office of Federal Contract. Okay, applies to those who contract with federal government or have, any dealings almost, because certainly it applies in universities and those types of things. And it requires that underrepresented classifications of employees have to be, it says properly, but positively recruited. And there's been a number of cases, and this has gone through a big change, in the 60s. When it was first put out as an executive order, a lot of businesses felt that it kind of meant quotas, and by quotas, not looking at national quotas, but looking in your own area. For example, in north central Montana, let's say our population is roughly, and forgive me for leaving out some groups, but roughly 80%. Caucasian and 20% maybe Native American. Well, if you had any kind of a business for a long time, you thought that, well, I better employ 80% Caucasians and 20% Native Americans to be fair. But in a case, the original one was the Bakke case, they said, no, quotas aren't the answer. That's not what we want. Quotas are illegal. Okay, and so we can't use quotas, but affirmative action is still the law of the land. We want you to affirmatively try to recruit people in our north central Montana, you'd say maybe Native Americans, to work. Okay, then another case came up here more recently in the 90s, and it was University of Michigan or Michigan State, and they were using a point system for entrance into their med school. Well, the point system automatically gave an extra 100 points to people in protected classes, and again, the university was sued by, some Caucasian applicants, white applicants, and ultimately that went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled once again that basically the point system was too much like a quota system. It gave too much preference, and that's not what affirmative action was, and so ruled against it and said affirmative action is still the law of the land. We still want to affirmatively try to recruit and employ people who are part of those protected classes, but using a point system goes too far. Okay, and so what the Supreme Court kind of continues to say when they make these rulings too is that the goal here that we have is that affirmative action is ultimately unnecessary, right? That people are treated fairly, not necessarily equally, but fairly, okay, in employment practices, and that's our goal. And then in such a case, then affirmative action, the executive order, would be unnecessary. There we go. I've already done some of these, right? Courts are going to impose affirmative action on private employers, right? If a standing history of discrimination is evident, okay. And again, we see reverse discrimination in many cases. So it's interesting, classification that's benefited the most from affirmative action has been white women, huh? Okay. So discrimination based on disabilities. Let's come back and take a look at that in part 4.